Millionaire laughed a lot at his brother, who inherited only a duck from his father. But 1 year later, what ended up happening made the millionaire regret for the rest of his life. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The morning fog rolled thick across the cobblestone streets of Millbrook, a quaint market town in the Yorkshire Dales, as Alexander Wellington adjusted his Italian silk tie in the rearview mirror of his Range Rover. The successful businessman had made the 3-hour drive from London for what he assumed would be a straightforward reading of his father's will. At 45, Alexander had spent the last 2 decades building upon his father's agricultural supply company, transforming Wellington Agricultural Solutions from a local business into a national corporation. He stepped out of his vehicle, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the ancient stones of the courthouse steps. The familiar scent of fresh-baked bread from the nearby bakery brought back memories of his childhood, though he quickly pushed them aside. There was business to attend to. Inside, he found his younger brother, Thomas, already seated in the solicitor's office. At 35, Thomas couldn't have looked more different from his older brother. While Alexander wore a bespoke suit that probably cost more than Thomas earned in 3 months, the younger Wellington was dressed in well-worn work clothes, his calloused hands betraying his profession as a stonemason. "You're late," Thomas said, not looking up from his phone. Alexander checked his watch. "I'm exactly on time, which means you're early. Some of us have actual businesses to run, Tommy." Before Thomas could respond, Mr. Blackwood, their father's solicitor for over 3 decades, entered the room. The elderly lawyer carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days, much like the wood-paneled office they sat in. "Gentlemen," Mr. Blackwood began, settling into his chair, "thank you for coming. As you know, we're here to discuss the last will and testament of your father, Edmund Wellington." He paused, adjusting his reading glasses. "Before we begin, I must say that your father was very specific about certain details." Alexander straightened in his chair. He had been running the company for years now, and while his father had officially retired 5 years ago, he had maintained majority ownership. Alexander expected today would finally formalize what everyone already knew, that he would become the sole owner of Wellington Agricultural Solutions. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat and began reading. "To my eldest son, Alexander Edmund Wellington, I leave 80% of Wellington Agricultural Solutions, along with the following properties: the main house in Millbrook, the London apartment, and the holiday cottage in Cornwall." Alexander nodded, satisfaction evident on his face. This was exactly what he had expected. "However," Mr. Blackwood continued, "there are certain conditions attached to this inheritance, which we will discuss shortly." The solicitor turned to Thomas. "To my younger son, Thomas James Wellington, I leave—" Mr. Blackwood paused, double-checking the document. "1 duck." The silence that followed was deafening. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, leaning forward. "Did you say a duck?" "Yes, specifically the duck currently residing in the pond behind your father's house, the one with the distinctive white marking on its wing. Your father named it Perseus." Alexander couldn't contain himself any longer and burst out laughing. "A duck? Father left you a duck? Oh, this is priceless." Thomas sat there, stunned. He had never expected to inherit the company. That had always been Alexander's domain. But a duck? It seemed like a cruel joke. "Mr. Blackwood raised his hand. "There's more. The duck comes with a small parcel of land, specifically the 2 acres surrounding the pond where it lives." 2 acres and a duck, Alexander scoffed. "Well, little brother, it seems father had a sense of humor after all." Thomas remained quiet, his mind racing. He remembered that duck. It was an odd one, always following his father around whenever he visited the pond. His father had spent countless hours there in his final years, seemingly talking to the bird as if it were a person. "Additionally," Mr. Blackwood continued, "there is a sealed envelope for each of you, to be opened exactly 1 month from today. Your father was most insistent about this timing." As they left the solicitor's office, Alexander clapped his brother on the shoulder. "Well, Tommy, I'd say good luck with your new pet, but I've got a company to run. Maybe you can start a little petting zoo." He chuckled as he walked to his car. Thomas stood on the courthouse steps, watching his brother drive away. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a clear spring day. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hey, Claire," he said when his girlfriend answered. "You'll never believe what just happened. How much do you know about ducks?" Claire, a local veterinarian, laughed on the other end. More than most people, I suppose. Why? Because, Thomas said, starting to walk toward his father's house, now Alexander's house. I just inherited one. And I think there's more to this story than meets the eye. Claire Matthews stood at the edge of the pond, her veterinary expertise evident in the way she observed the unusual duck. Perseus, as the bird was called, was unlike any duck she'd seen before. Its feathers had an iridescent quality that seemed to shift colors in the sunlight, and its bearing was almost regal. "This isn't just any duck, Tom," she said, making notes on her tablet. "The markings, the size, even the way it moves. This is something special. I'd need to run some tests to be sure, but I think your father might have been breeding this line for specific traits." Thomas watched as Perseus waddled toward them, stopping occasionally to preen its distinctive white-marked wing. Dad always was obsessed with breeding programs and genetic improvements. It's how he built the agricultural supply business in the first place, developing better feed formulas, consulting on livestock breeding. The spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the 2 acres that now belonged to Thomas. The land, while small, was perfectly situated. The pond sat in a natural depression, fed by an underground spring, and the surrounding soil was rich and dark. "You know," Claire said, her green eyes lighting up with excitement, "with your construction experience and my veterinary knowledge, we could do something here. Something sustainable, something that would honor your father's work." Thomas ran his hands through his hair, a habit from childhood that surfaced whenever he was deep in thought. "What exactly are you thinking?" "An organic duck farm," Claire replied, already pacing the perimeter of the pond. "But not just any farm, a model of sustainable agriculture. Your father's company focuses on industrial-scale farming, but there's a growing market for ethically sourced small-scale production. Perseus could be the beginning of a unique breeding program." As if responding to his name, Perseus quacked and approached Claire, allowing her to examine him more closely. "Look at this," she said, gently spreading one of the duck's wings. "The muscle structure is exceptional. This is the result of careful breeding over multiple generations. Your father didn't just happen to have this duck. He created it." Thomas sat down on a nearby log, his mind racing with possibilities. "But I don't know the first thing about running a farm. And Alexander's got all the business experience." Claire sat beside him, taking his hand. "But you know how to build things. You understand materials, planning, construction. We could start small. A few sustainable buildings around the pond, proper housing for the ducks, maybe a small processing facility. I can handle the veterinary side and help with the breeding program." "We'd need money," Thomas pointed out. "Planning permission, equipment." "I've got some savings," Claire offered. "And there are grants available for sustainable farming initiatives. Your father left you this land and this duck for a reason, Tom. He must have seen something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself yet." As they talked, the sun began to set, painting the pond in shades of gold and pink. Perseus had settled near them, preening contentedly. "You know what Alexander would say about this," Thomas said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "He'd say we're crazy, that you can't build a business from one duck and a pond." Claire squeezed his hand. "Maybe that's exactly what your father wanted, to prove that something meaningful can grow from the smallest beginning. Besides," she added with a grin, "proving Alexander wrong would be a nice bonus, wouldn't it?" Thomas laughed, the first genuine laugh since the reading of the will. It would at that. They spent the next few hours walking the property, making plans. Claire's tablet filled with notes about potential building locations, optimal duck housing designs, and sustainable water management systems. Thomas's contractor mind was already calculating materials and costs, seeing the potential in every slope and corner of the land. As evening approached, Perseus followed them to the property line, quacking what seemed like a goodbye. "First thing tomorrow," Thomas said, "I'll start looking into those grants you mentioned. And I'll talk to my crew. Many of them would be willing to help with the initial construction in exchange for future considerations." Claire beamed at him. "That's the Thomas Wellington I know, always thinking about how to build something solid." As they walked to their cars, Thomas cast one last look at the pond, now silvered by the rising moon. His father had spent countless hours here in his final years, and Thomas had always wondered why. Now standing on his own piece of land, with a duck that might be more valuable than anyone suspected, and a partner who shared his vision, He was beginning to understand. "You know what's strange?" he said to Claire. "When Dad used to sit out here with Perseus, I thought he was just an old man wasting time with a duck. But maybe he was planning something bigger all along." "There's that sealed envelope you're supposed to open in a month," Claire reminded him. "I bet there are more surprises waiting." Thomas nodded, his mind already racing with plans for tomorrow. 1 duck and 2 acres. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you needed. 2 weeks after inheriting Perseus, Thomas stood on his land, surrounded by surveyors' stakes and construction equipment. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the property as his former crew members, now volunteers in his ambitious project, began arriving. The sound of trucks and friendly banter filled the air as Claire supervised the delivery of their first batch of specialized duck housing materials. "I still can't believe we got the planning permission so quickly," Thomas said as Claire joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the temporary site office. A repurposed shipping container painted in cheerful green. "Well, it helps that your sustainable farming proposal aligned perfectly with the council's new green initiative," Claire replied, handing him a cup. "Plus, I think Mrs. Henderson from the council has a soft spot for Perseus." As if on cue, Perseus waddled past them, followed by 3 new feathered companions, the first additions to what Claire hoped would become a thriving breeding program. The ducks had been carefully selected from heritage breeds that complemented Perseus's unique genetic profile. "Speaking of our star duck," Claire continued, "the preliminary DNA tests came back this morning. Tom, your father wasn't just breeding any duck. Perseus carries genetic markers I've never seen before. The combination suggests enhanced disease resistance, superior egg production, and exceptional adaptability to varying weather conditions." Thomas watched as his friend Mike, a master carpenter, began marking out the foundation for the first duck house. The design they'd developed combined traditional Yorkshire building techniques with modern sustainable materials. Solar panels would power gentle heating systems for winter, while rainwater collection would supplement the natural pond. "Dad always said the future of farming was in adaptation," Thomas mused. "I just never thought he meant it quite so literally." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpectedly familiar Range Rover. Alexander stepped out, his usual impeccable suit looking somewhat out of place among the construction equipment. "Well, well," Alexander said, surveying the scene. "When Mrs. Henderson mentioned a new sustainable farming project at the planning committee meeting, I had no idea my little brother was attempting to become Old MacDonald." "What do you want, Alex?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Can't a man check on his brother's investment?" Alexander replied, sidestepping a wheelbarrow full of recycled building materials. "Though I must say, you're putting quite a lot of effort into a hobby farm. Those solar panels alone must have cost a fortune." Claire stepped forward. "We received a grant from the Regional Sustainable Agriculture Fund. Our proposal scored in the top percentile." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Did it now? How interesting. You know, Thomas, if you wanted to get into agriculture, you could have just asked for a job at Wellington Agricultural Solutions. We're always looking for—" He paused, glancing at the construction site. "Manual laborers." Before Thomas could respond, Perseus suddenly appeared between them, spreading his wings in what seemed like a defensive posture. The duck's unusual behavior caught Alexander off guard, causing him to step back. "That bird is not normal," Alexander muttered. "No," Claire agreed, a slight smile playing on her lips. "He's extraordinary. Just like your father's vision for sustainable farming, if you'd ever taken the time to listen to him talk about it." Alexander's expression flickered for a moment, something unreadable crossing his face. "Yes, well, speaking of father's vision, I trust you'll both be present for the opening of those sealed envelopes next week. I have a feeling there might be some clarifications about this whole inheritance situation." "We'll be there," Thomas assured him, watching as his brother retreated to his car. After Alexander left, Claire and Thomas returned to supervising the construction. By midday, the foundations for the first duck house were laid, and the team had begun assembling the innovative water filtration system that would keep the pond clean while using the nutrient-rich water for crop irrigation. "You know what's odd?" Claire said as they broke for lunch, sharing sandwiches with the volunteer crew. "Your brother seemed almost worried about something. Did you notice how he kept looking at Perseus?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Alex never does anything without a reason. Him showing up here today, mentioning the envelopes, he knows something we don't. Or he thinks he does, Claire suggested. Either way, we keep building. Look how much we've accomplished in just 2 weeks. By the time those envelopes are opened, we'll have the basic infrastructure in place. As the afternoon wore on, more progress was made. The eco-friendly duck houses began taking shape, their curved roofs designed to collect rainwater while providing optimal ventilation. Claire worked with a local wildlife expert to enhance the pond's ecosystem, introducing beneficial plants and creating shallow areas perfect for ducks to forage. Perseus and his new companions seemed to approve of the changes, exploring each new addition with curious enthusiasm. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the original duck appeared to be leading the others, showing them the best spots for feeding and rest. "It's almost like he knows what we're building," Thomas remarked to Claire as they watched the sunset paint the construction site in golden hues. "Maybe he does," Claire replied. "Your father spent years with him, remember? And we're only beginning to understand how intelligent these birds really are." As they prepared to leave for the day, Thomas took one last look at the progress they'd made. In just 2 weeks, they'd transformed a simple pond and 2 acres into the beginning of something remarkable. But Alexander's visit had left him uneasy. "Whatever's in those envelopes," he said to Claire, "we need to be prepared for anything." Claire squeezed his hand. "We will be. And whatever happens, we're building something real here, something that matters." As if in agreement, Perseus quacked loudly from his favorite spot by the pond, his unique, white-marked wing catching the last rays of sunlight. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Mr. Blackwood's office as Thomas and Claire arrived for the opening of the sealed envelopes. Alexander was already there, engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation in the corner. "No, absolutely not," they heard him say sharply before ending the call. He turned to them with a tight smile. "Shall we get this over with?" Mr. Blackwood entered, carrying 2 identical envelopes, each sealed with the Wellington family crest in dark green wax. "Your father was most specific about the timing of this revelation," he said, placing the envelopes on his desk. "He wanted you to have exactly 1 month to process the initial inheritance." Thomas accepted his envelope with steady hands, while Alexander practically snatched his. The room fell silent, except for the sound of tearing paper. Thomas unfolded his letter and began to read. "My dear Thomas, if you're reading this, you've had a month to consider your inheritance. Perseus is no ordinary duck, as I'm sure Dr. Matthews has discovered by now. He represents 15 years of careful breeding, combining resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. The white marking on his wing isn't just for show. It's a genetic marker I developed, indicating superior breeding traits. But more importantly, Perseus and his lineage carry something even more valuable: the future of sustainable farming. The genetics I've developed could revolutionize small-scale agriculture, making it possible for family farms to thrive again. There's more. Check the pond's depth at its center. You'll find something interesting approximately 2 meters down in a waterproof container. The contents will explain everything. All my love, Dad." Thomas looked up to see Alexander's face had gone pale as he read his own letter. His brother's hands were shaking slightly. "Mr. Blackwood," Alexander said, his voice unusually uncertain, "there must be some mistake. Father couldn't possibly have meant—" The elderly solicitor adjusted his glasses. "Your father left specific instructions about today. Perhaps, Alexander, you'd like to share the contents of your letter with your brother." Alexander remained silent, clutching his letter tightly. "If he won't, I will," Mr. Blackwood continued. "You see, Thomas, your father included a crucial clause in his will. If within 1 year of his passing, the owner of Wellington Agricultural Solutions fails to implement sustainable farming practices across at least 60% of its supplier network, the ownership of the company transfers to the holder of the genetic patents for the sustainable breeding program." He paused meaningfully. "The patents that are currently stored in a waterproof container at the bottom of your pond." Claire gasped softly. "The DNA tests, the unique genetic markers, that's why they seem so revolutionary. Your father wasn't just breeding a better duck. He was creating a template for sustainable livestock breeding." "This is absurd," Alexander snapped. "You can't possibly expect me to reorganize our entire supplier network based on some duck breeding program." "Actually," Mr. Blackwood replied, Your father not only expected it, he planned for it. The letter you're holding explains how the transition should work. He believed that combining Wellington Agricultural Solutions resources with Thomas's sustainable breeding program would create something extraordinary. Thomas sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. His father hadn't given him just a duck and a pond. He'd given him leverage to transform the entire Wellington agricultural empire. "We should retrieve that container," Claire said softly. "I know some people who can help us safely search the pond without disturbing the ecosystem." Alexander stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. I've spent 20 years building this company. You can't honestly believe Father would throw all that away for some environmental experiment." "No," Thomas replied, finally finding his voice. "He's not throwing it away. He's giving us a chance to build something better. Together." He turned to his brother. "Think about it, Alex. Why do you think he left you 80% of the company instead of all of it? He wanted us to work together. Your business experience, my practical knowledge, and his research." "And what if I refuse?" Alexander challenged. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. Then, according to the will, Thomas would gain controlling interest in the company after 1 year. Your father was quite clear about this condition. The room fell silent again, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside. Alexander paced the office, his usual composure cracking. "You know," Claire ventured, "this could be an incredible opportunity. Wellington Agricultural Solutions has the network and resources to implement sustainable practices on a massive scale. Combined with the breeding program's innovations, you could lead a revolution in British farming." Thomas watched his brother carefully. "Remember what Dad always said about adaptation being the future of farming? He wasn't just talking about the animals, was he?" Alexander stopped pacing, looking down at the letter in his hands. For a moment he looked less like the confident businessman and more like the boy who used to help their father in the greenhouse. "I'll need to see these patents," he said finally, "and run the numbers on implementing sustainable practices across our supplier network. It won't be easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Thomas replied, offering his hand to his brother. "But we're Wellingtons. Building things is what we do." As they left Mr. Blackwood's office, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Tomorrow they would begin the careful process of retrieving their father's final gift from the pond. But today, something equally valuable had been salvaged. The beginning of understanding between two brothers who had grown too far apart. Back at the pond, Perseus watched the sunset with his companions, unaware that he had been the key to unlocking a transformation that would reshape not just 2 acres of Yorkshire countryside, but the future of British farming itself. The morning fog clung to the pond as a team of specialized divers prepared their equipment. Thomas, Claire, and Alexander stood watching as the professionals carefully mapped out their search pattern. Perseus and his growing flock observed the proceedings from a respectful distance, their quiet quacks echoing across the water. "Are you sure this won't harm the ecosystem?" Thomas asked Claire, watching as the divers double-checked their sonar equipment. "These folks are experts in ecological preservation," Claire assured him. "They work with wildlife sanctuaries all the time. Besides, Perseus seems calm enough about it." Alexander, who had exchanged his usual suit for more practical attire, studied a tablet displaying the pond's topographical map. "According to the survey, there's a natural depression near the center, about 2 meters down, just as Father's letter indicated. The past week had brought subtle changes to the dynamic between the brothers. While tension still simmered beneath the surface, they had begun talking more, sharing meals at the site office and actually listening to each other's ideas. The first diver slipped into the water, creating barely a ripple. Underwater lights illuminated the murky depths as the search began. Thomas found himself holding his breath, years of his father's work potentially resting in a waterproof container beneath the surface. "Mr. Wellington!" The diver's voice crackled over the radio. "We've found something." Minutes later, a sleek metal case emerged from the pond. Despite years underwater, the container's seal had held perfectly. Alexander examined the locking mechanism with growing respect. "Titanium alloy," he murmured. "Biometric lock. Father didn't leave anything to chance." Claire brought over her tablet, which they'd loaded with the scanning software mentioned in Thomas's letter. After a tense moment, the lock clicked open. Inside, they found a waterproof hard drive, several notebooks filled with Edmund Wellington's precise handwriting, and a USB drive labeled For my sons. We should take this to the office, Alexander suggested, his businessman's instincts kicking in. Our legal team needs to review everything before— No, Thomas interrupted firmly. We do this here together, like Dad wanted. They set up a laptop in the site office. As Claire carefully dried and organized the notebooks, the brothers inserted the USB drive. Their father's face appeared on screen, recorded sometime before his passing. "My boys," Edmund Wellington began, his familiar smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "If you're watching this, you've begun to understand why I divided the inheritance as I did. Alexander, you've always had a brilliant mind for business, but you sometimes forget that true growth comes from nurturing what you have, not just acquiring more. And Thomas, your hands may build walls, but your heart has always known how to build bridges." The recording continued as Edmund detailed his vision. The genetic breakthroughs he'd achieved with Perseus weren't limited to ducks. The same principles could be applied to other livestock, creating breeds that were hardier, more efficient, and better suited to small-scale farming. The patents and research in those notebooks, Edmund explained, are worth millions, but their true value lies in how they're used. Together you could transform Wellington Agricultural Solutions into something revolutionary, a company that helps family farms thrive while protecting the environment. Alexander leaned forward, studying the financial projections their father had prepared. These numbers, they're actually quite impressive. The initial investment in converting our suppliers would be significant, but the long-term returns— And look at this, Claire added, poring over one of the notebooks. Your father's breeding program didn't just focus on production metrics. He found ways to enhance natural disease resistance, reduce feed requirements, and improve adaptation to climate change. As they delved deeper into Edmund's research, a commotion outside drew their attention. Perseus had led his flock to the office window, their quiet quacking almost like an endorsement. Dad always said Perseus was special, Thomas remembered. I used to think he was just being sentimental, but he was actually letting us watch his research in action. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discoveries. Edmund's notebooks revealed years of careful observation, failed experiments, and breakthrough moments. The genetic markers he'd developed didn't just make livestock more productive, they made them more resilient while reducing their environmental impact. As the sun began to set, Alexander finally looked up from the financial projections he'd been studying. "This could work," he admitted. "It won't be easy and some of our shareholders won't like it, but—" He gestured at the research spread before them. "This is the future. Father saw it coming years ago." "We'll need to move carefully," Thomas agreed. "Start with pilot programs, prove the concept works on a larger scale." "And protect the intellectual property," Claire added. "These breakthroughs could attract attention from some major agricultural corporations." Alexander nodded, a familiar, determined look crossing his face. "I'll have our legal team begin the patent registration process first thing tomorrow. But," he held up a hand as Thomas began to protest, "you'll be included in every meeting, every decision. This is a family business after all." As they prepared to leave for the day, Thomas noticed Perseus leading his flock in their evening routine, a graceful dance of feeding, preening, and settling in for the night. The white marking on his wing caught the last rays of sunlight, a beacon of their father's foresight. "You know what this means," Claire said softly, watching the scene. "Your father didn't just leave you a duck and some land. He left you a revolution." Thomas smiled, thinking of the construction already underway, the sustainable systems they were building, and now the possibility of transforming his family's company into something truly meaningful. "He left us a choice," Thomas corrected, looking at his brother, "and I think we're finally ready to make the right one." The Wellington Agricultural Solutions boardroom buzzed with tension as Alexander stood before the company's major shareholders. 6 weeks had passed since the discovery of Edmund's research, and the time had come to present their new direction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his usual confidence tempered with a new sense of purpose, "for 20 years we've led the agricultural supply industry by focusing on size and efficiency. Today I'm proposing something revolutionary, a transition to sustainable farming practices, supported by breakthrough genetic research." The presentation screen behind him displayed charts, projections, and images of the pilot program already underway at Thomas's farm. Perseus and his growing flock featured prominently in the data. their successful breeding program proving Edmund's theories correct. "This is absurd," interrupted Gerald Blackthorne, one of the company's longest-serving board members. "We're not some hippie commune. We're a serious agricultural business. These sustainable practices would cut into our profit margins significantly." "Initially, yes," Alexander acknowledged, "but our projections show that within 3 years, the reduced input costs and premium pricing for sustainably produced goods will actually increase our profitability by 28%. Thomas, seated quietly at the back of the room, watched his brother handle the skeptical shareholders with growing admiration. Alexander had spent weeks studying their father's research, combining Edmund's scientific breakthroughs with his own business acumen to create a viable transition plan. "And what about our existing suppliers?" another shareholder demanded. "You expect them to completely overhaul their operations based on some experimental breeding program?" "Actually," Thomas spoke up, standing to join his brother, "we've already implemented the program with 3 of our major suppliers. The preliminary results have exceeded our projections." He clicked to the next slide, showing footage from the pilot farms. Livestock bred using Edmund's techniques were thriving, requiring less feed while producing better yields. The sustainable farming practices had reduced water usage by 40% and nearly eliminated the need for artificial fertilizers. "This isn't just about doing good," Alexander continued. "It's about staying competitive. The market is changing. Consumers are demanding sustainably produced food, and government regulations are tightening. We can lead this change or be left behind." As the meeting continued, Claire waited anxiously at the pilot farm, overseeing the arrival of new breeding pairs. The program had expanded beyond ducks, applying Edmund's principles to chickens, geese, and even some heritage pig breeds. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "Board split 60-40 in favor. We're going ahead." Claire smiled, watching Perseus lead his flock through their daily routine. The original duck had proven to be an extraordinary patriarch, his offspring displaying all the beneficial traits Edmund had bred for, and some they were still discovering. Back in the boardroom, Alexander was wrapping up the presentation when his phone rang. The caller ID showed one of their largest competitors. "Excuse me," he said, stepping out to take the call. Thomas followed, concerned by the look on his brother's face. "They know," Alexander said after ending the call. "Somehow they've heard about Father's research. They're offering to buy us out, triple our current market value." Thomas felt his stomach clench. "How did they find out?" "Must be someone on the board," Alexander mused. "This is just the beginning, Tom. Once the patents are public, every major agricultural corporation will be after this technology." "But they can't replicate it without Perseus and the breeding program," Thomas pointed out. "Father made sure of that. The genetic markers are just part of the puzzle. The real secret is in the selective breeding process we're developing." Alexander nodded slowly, a plan forming. "We need to move faster, accelerate the pilot program, get more farmers on board before someone tries to steal this out from under us." "That means more construction at the farm," Thomas said. "More breeding facilities, better security." "Whatever it takes," Alexander agreed. "Father trusted us with this legacy. We're not going to let him down." They returned to the boardroom to find Claire had sent new footage from the farm, Perseus and his flock demonstrating the social behaviors that made their breeding program so unique. The shareholders watched in fascination as the birds worked together, displaying intelligence and adaptability that seemed almost impossible. "This is what sustainable farming looks like," Alexander announced. "Not just better animals, but better practices. Better relationships with our suppliers, better stewardship of the land." As the shareholders filed out, Thomas caught snippets of their conversations, excitement mixing with skepticism, greed with genuine interest in the possibilities. "We'll need to watch our backs," he said to Alexander once they were alone. "Already on it," his brother replied. "I've hired additional security for the farm, and our legal team is working overtime to protect the patents." Thomas smiled, remembering their father's words from the video. "True growth comes from nurturing what you have." "You know what's funny?" he said to Alexander. "A month ago I thought Dad had played a cruel joke, leaving me just a duck and a pond. Now I realize he left us both exactly what we needed. You got a chance to build something meaningful, instead of just profitable, and I got a chance to prove I could create something valuable from scratch." Alexander clapped his brother on the shoulder. He always was several steps ahead of us. Come on, let's get back to the farm. Claire messaged earlier. Apparently Perseus has some new tricks to show us. As they drove through the Yorkshire countryside, both brothers knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. Their father's legacy wasn't just about sustainable farming or genetic breakthroughs. It was about bringing two brothers together to create something revolutionary. Back at the farm, Perseus waited by the pond, his white-marked wing catching the afternoon sun, a living symbol of Edmund Wellington's vision for the future of farming. The autumn wind rustled through the expanded duck farm, now a thriving example of sustainable agriculture. 3 months had passed since the shareholders' meeting, and the Wellington brothers' vision was taking shape. The original 2 acres had grown to 15, thanks to neighbouring farmers who'd been inspired to join the initiative. Claire stood in the newly constructed research facility, analysing data from their latest breeding program. Perseus's offspring had exceeded all expectations, with each generation showing stronger beneficial traits. But it wasn't just the ducks. Their methods were successfully being applied to other livestock, creating a revolution in sustainable farming. "Dr. Matthews," her assistant called from the doorway. "You might want to see this." Outside, a group of suited individuals was walking the perimeter of the property, taking photos and making notes. Their corporate badges identified them as representatives from Meridian Agricultural Corporation, one of the largest agribusiness companies in Europe. Thomas arrived moments later in his truck, dirt on his boots from inspecting the new irrigation system. "Third time this week," he muttered, watching the visitors. "Different company, same intention. They're getting bolder," Claire observed. "Yesterday I caught one of them trying to take feather samples from Perseus's flock." Inside the site office, Alexander was engaged in a heated phone conversation. "No, absolutely not," he said firmly. "Wellington Agricultural Solutions is not for sale at any price." He hung up and turned to Thomas and Claire. "That's the 5th buyout offer this month. They're getting desperate." The success of their sustainable farming program had caught the industry's attention. The Wellington brothers' pilot farms were showing remarkable results: higher yields, healthier animals, and significantly lower environmental impact. Traditional agribusiness corporations saw it as a threat to their conventional farming model. "We've got bigger problems," Claire said, pulling up a satellite image on her tablet. "Look at this. Meridian just bought all the land surrounding our eastern boundary. They're planning to build a massive industrial farm right next door." "They're trying to box us in," Alexander realized, studying the map. "If they surround us with industrial operations, they could potentially contaminate our water supply, affect our soil quality." "Not if we move first," Thomas interrupted, spreading out a set of construction plans. "Remember those local farmers who've been asking to join our program? Their land forms a natural buffer zone around us." The brothers had spent the past months refining their father's vision. Wellington Agricultural Solutions was now offering partnership programs to small farmers, providing them with sustainably bred livestock, training in organic farming methods, and guaranteed purchase agreements for their products. "Today it's not just about protecting our operation anymore," Thomas continued. "It's about protecting the whole community's right to farm sustainably." Alexander nodded, already pulling up financial projections. "We can fast-track the partnership agreements. If we can get 10 more farms converted to our methods before winter—" "15, came a voice from the doorway. Mrs. Henderson from the council stood there, clutching a folder. "I've got 15 local farms ready to sign up right now. The council has just approved an initiative to support sustainable farming in our region." The news spread quickly through the farming community. By sunset, the site office was packed with local farmers, many of whom had worked with Edmund Wellington years ago. They shared stories of how industrial farming had pressured them to abandon traditional methods, and how the Wellington Brothers program offered hope for preserving their way of life. "Your father would be proud," Mrs. Henderson said softly to Thomas as they watched Perseus lead his flock in their evening routine. "He always said the future of farming was in working with nature, not against it." Late that night, after the visitors had left, Thomas and Alexander sat by the pond, sharing a bottle of their father's favorite whiskey. "You know," Alexander said, watching Perseus settle his flock for the night, "I used to think father's obsession with sustainable farming was just his way of rebelling against modern business practices. But he saw something we didn't, the power of patience, of letting things grow naturally." "Speaking of growing," Thomas replied, Claire's latest tests show something interesting. The soil quality around our duck ponds is improving dramatically. The integrated system, the ducks, the plants, the natural water filtration, it's creating a self-sustaining ecosystem. Alexander smiled, remembering their father's words. True innovation doesn't fight nature, it learns from it. A shooting star streaked across the clear Yorkshire sky, reflecting in the pond's still waters. Perseus raised his head, his white-marked wing catching the moonlight, a living testament to Edmund Wellington's legacy. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Alexander said, checking his phone. "The news about Meridian's land grab has reached the national papers. We're about to become the face of sustainable farming in Britain." "Good," Thomas replied firmly. "It's time people understood what's really at stake here. It's not just about ducks or profits. It's about choosing what kind of future we want to create." As they walked back to their cars, the brothers paused to watch Perseus guiding a new group of ducklings toward their shelter. Each one bore the distinctive white wing marking, carrying forward their father's vision into a new generation. "You know what's funny?" Thomas said. "Our duck inheritance that seemed like a joke has turned into the most valuable thing Father could have left us." "Not the most valuable," Alexander corrected, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. "He left us something better, a chance to build something meaningful together." The autumn wind carried the sound of ducks settling for the night, a peaceful chorus that belied the battles ahead. But the Wellington brothers were ready, their father's legacy growing stronger with each passing day, one sustainable farm at a time. The morning frost covered the expanded Wellington farm in a crystalline blanket as a convoy of vehicles wound its way up the access road. News vans, local farmers' trucks, and even a few government cars created an unlikely parade through the Yorkshire countryside. "Ready for this?" Claire asked Thomas as they watched the arrivals from the research facility's observation deck. Below them, Perseus and his flock went about their morning routine, seemingly unfazed by the growing crowd. "As ready as I'll ever be," Thomas replied, adjusting his tie, a concession to the day's importance. "Is Alexander set with the presentation?" "Born ready," came Alexander's voice behind them. He looked every inch the successful businessman, but his eyes held a new warmth that had been developing over the past months. "The Minister of Agriculture's office just confirmed. She'll be here in an hour." Today marked the official launch of the Wellington Sustainable Farming Initiative, a partnership program that would help small farmers across Britain transition to sustainable practices. The brothers had worked tirelessly to prepare, combining Alexander's business acumen with Thomas's practical knowledge and Claire's scientific expertise. In the main presentation area, formerly a hay barn thoughtfully converted into a modern conference space, local farmers mingled with environmental scientists, agricultural experts, and media representatives. The walls displayed photos and data from their successful pilot program, healthy animals, flourishing crops, and smiling farmers standing proud on their restored land. "Mr. Wellington," called a reporter, hurrying toward them, "is it true that Meridian Agricultural Corporation has filed a lawsuit attempting to block your partnership program?" "Actually," Alexander stepped forward smoothly, "we've just received word that the court has dismissed Meridian's claims as baseless. Our patents and methods are fully protected under law." What Alexander didn't mention was the sleepless nights they'd spent protecting their father's legacy. Meridian had tried everything, from attempting to poach their researchers to spreading rumors about the safety of their breeding program. But the Wellington brothers had learned from their father's foresight, documenting everything meticulously and building unshakable relationships with their partner farmers. The Minister of Agriculture arrived right on schedule, accompanied by her advisors and Mrs. Henderson from the local council. As they toured the facility, Claire explained how their integrated farming system worked, from Perseus's genetically enhanced line to the natural water filtration systems and organic pest control methods. "And these results are reproducible?" the minister asked, studying the data displays. "Absolutely," Claire confirmed. "We've successfully implemented the system on 23 farms so far, with consistent improvements in yield, animal welfare, and environmental impact." Thomas led the group outside, where the morning frost had melted to reveal the vibrant life their methods had encouraged. Native wildflowers bloomed despite the late season, supporting a healthy population of bees and butterflies. Perseus, ever the showman, chose that moment to lead his flock in a perfect demonstration of their natural foraging patterns. "Remarkable," the minister murmured, watching the ducks work together to maintain their pond ecosystem. "And this all started with one duck?" "One duck and a father's vision," Thomas corrected. Dad knew that farming needed to change, but he also knew it had to be a gradual, natural process. You can't force sustainable practices. You have to let them grow organically, just like everything else in nature. The presentation that followed was a testament to how far they'd come. Alexander outlined their expansion plans, while Thomas explained the practical aspects of implementing their methods. Claire presented the scientific data backing their results, and local farmers shared their success stories. "This isn't just about sustainable farming," Alexander concluded. "It's about sustainable communities. Every farm that joins our program becomes part of a network, supporting each other and sharing knowledge." As if to emphasize his point, a group of partner farmers' children ran past the windows, chasing each other through the demonstration gardens they'd helped plant. The future of farming, learning and playing together. The minister's announcement exceeded their expectations. The government would provide matching funds for farmers wanting to join the Wellington program, along with fast-track approval for sustainable farming certifications. "Your father was right," Mrs. Henderson said later, as they watched the media circus pack up. "Sometimes the smallest beginnings lead to the biggest changes." That evening, after the crowds had gone, the Wellington brothers sat in their favorite spot by Perseus's pond. The original duck watched over his greatly expanded flock, his white-marked wing still distinctive among the hundreds of birds that now called the farm home. "Did you ever imagine," Thomas asked, "when I inherited one duck and you got the company, that we'd end up here?" Alexander laughed. "Father always said we were better together than apart. I just never understood what he meant until now." Claire joined them, carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. "To Edmund Wellington," she proposed a toast. "Who knew that the future of farming would start with one very special duck?" "To Perseus," Thomas added, watching their flagship duck guide some younger birds through their evening routine. "To family," Alexander finished, putting an arm around his brother's shoulders. "The one thing that matters more than any inheritance." As the sun set over their expanded farm, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the brothers could almost hear their father's gentle laughter on the evening breeze. His final gift hadn't been a duck or a company. It had been the wisdom to see that true success comes from nurturing both the land and the bonds between people who work it. Perseus settled in for the night, his white-marked wing catching the last rays of sunlight, a living symbol of how one small inheritance could change not just 2 brothers' lives, but the future of farming itself. Spring had returned to Yorkshire, and with it came a transformation that even Edmund Wellington might have found remarkable. The Wellington Sustainable Farming Initiative had grown far beyond its humble beginnings, now encompassing over 100 partner farms across Britain. Thomas stood at the edge of the original pond, now the centerpiece of what locals had dubbed the Wellington Way. Perseus, showing his age but still regal, supervised his extensive family from his favorite perch. The original 2 acres had become the heart of a 30-acre research and training facility where farmers from across Europe came to learn sustainable farming methods. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Claire asked, joining him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her white lab coat bore the new Wellington Research Institute logo, a stylized duck with a distinctive white-marked wing. "Just remembering," Thomas replied, accepting the coffee. "1 year ago, this was just a pond with a single duck. Now look at it." The view before them was impressive. Beyond the original pond, carefully designed wetlands supported diverse wildlife. Modern, eco-friendly buildings, many constructed by Thomas's old crew, housed research facilities, training centers, and visitor accommodations. Solar panels and wind turbines provided clean energy, while innovative water management systems ensured sustainable operation. Alexander's voice carried across the property as he led a group of international agricultural ministers on a tour. "The key to our success," he was saying, "is that we don't just provide the breeding stock, we create partnerships. Each farm that joins our network becomes part of a larger community." The transformation in Alexander had been as remarkable as the farm's growth. Gone was the ruthless businessman focused solely on profit margins. In his place stood a leader who understood that true success came from nurturing growth in people, animals, and the land itself. "Mr. Wellington," called one of Claire's research assistants, hurrying across the lawn. "The results from the Heritage Grain Program are in. You'll want to see this." Inside the main research building, Claire's team had laid out their findings. The sustainable farming methods developed for the duck program had yielded unexpected benefits when applied to crop production. Soil health had improved dramatically, leading to stronger, more resilient plants that required less water and no chemical fertilizers. "It's exactly what Dad predicted," Thomas said, examining the data. "He always said nature had the answers, if we just paid attention." Their father's presence seemed especially strong today. Perhaps it was because of tomorrow's event, the inaugural Edmund Wellington Memorial Lecture on Sustainable Agriculture, where the brothers would share their story with the next generation of farmers. A commotion outside drew their attention. Perseus had left his perch and was waddling determinedly toward the main gate, where a familiar figure stood hesitating. "Is that—" Claire squinted against the spring sunshine. "Is that Gerald Blackthorne?" The former board member who had so vocally opposed their sustainable farming initiative stood awkwardly at the entrance, watching Perseus approach. The duck stopped a few feet away, tilted his head as if in recognition, and waited. Thomas and Alexander exchanged glances before walking out to meet their old adversary. "Gerald," Alexander greeted him cautiously. "This is unexpected." The older man shifted uncomfortably. I owe you both an apology," he said finally. "I was wrong about this project. The results speak for themselves." It turned out Blackthorne had converted his own family farm to sustainable methods 6 months ago, working quietly with one of the Wellington partner farms. His yields had improved so dramatically that he could no longer keep his success to himself. "Your father," Gerald said, watching Perseus lead his flock in their afternoon routine. "He tried to tell me about this years ago, about working with nature instead of against it. I should have listened then." As they showed Gerald around the facility, more visitors arrived. Farmers, researchers, and environmental experts from around the world, all gathering for tomorrow's lecture. The Wellington Way had become a model for sustainable agriculture, proving that small-scale farming could be both environmentally friendly and economically viable. In the research lab, Claire's team made another breakthrough. The genetic markers Edmund had developed weren't just making livestock more resilient, they were helping species adapt to climate change. The implications were staggering. "Dad knew," Thomas said quietly to Alexander as they watched the sun set over their expanded kingdom. "He knew this would grow beyond anything we could imagine. That's why he split things the way he did. So we'd have to work together to make it happen." Perseus settled his flock for the night, his white-marked wing catching the last rays of sunlight. Like the Wellington brothers, he had grown into his role, becoming a symbol of how small beginnings could lead to revolutionary changes. As darkness fell, lights came on across the facility, powered by renewable energy and illuminating the path toward a sustainable future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the foundation their father had laid, built on 1 duck, 2 acres, and the unshakable bond between 2 brothers, would ensure that the Wellington legacy continued to grow naturally and sustainably, just as Edmund had envisioned. "You know what still amazes me?" Alexander said, watching the stars emerge above their thriving enterprise. "How Dad knew exactly what each of us needed to learn. I had to learn that true wealth comes from nurturing growth, not just acquiring assets. And I had to learn that sometimes the smallest inheritance can lead to the biggest changes," Thomas finished. "Together we're building something he would be proud of." Perseus quacked softly in agreement, as if acknowledging his role in bringing the Wellington family full circle, from a simple farm to an agricultural empire, and back to the fundamental truth that working with nature and with each other was the surest path to lasting success. The great hall of the Wellington Research Institute buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of guests gathered for the inaugural Edmund Wellington Memorial Lecture. The space, converted from an old barn with exposed beams and modern sustainable materials, perfectly embodied the blend of tradition and innovation that had become the Wellington trademark. Thomas adjusted his tie nervously backstage, looking out at the assembled crowd. Farmers from across Britain sat alongside international agricultural experts, environmental scientists and government officials. In the front row, Claire sat with Perseus's latest offspring, a specially bred duck that showed even more promising traits than its famous father. "Ready?" Alexander appeared beside him, tablet in hand. "Full house out there. Even got some streaming viewers from agricultural programs worldwide." The brothers had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing it was more than just a lecture. It was a celebration of their father's vision and the remarkable journey that had brought them here. As they took the stage, a large screen behind them displayed a photo of Edmund Wellington, sitting by the original pond with Perseus. The image transformed into a series of before and after shots, showing the evolution of their sustainable farming initiative. "1 year ago," Alexander began, "our father left us an unusual inheritance. To me, he left most of the family company. To my brother, he left a duck." Laughter rippled through the audience. "What we didn't realize then," Thomas continued, "was that he'd left us both exactly what we needed to learn. The company needed to reconnect with its roots in sustainable farming. The duck, well, Perseus turned out to be much more than just a duck." For the next hour, they shared their story. Alexander explained how Wellington Agricultural Solutions had transformed its entire supplier network to sustainable practices, increasing profitability while reducing environmental impact. Thomas described the development of their partner farm program, which had created a supportive community of sustainable farmers across Britain. Claire joined them on stage to present the scientific data behind their success. The genetic improvements Edmund had pioneered were showing remarkable results across multiple species, creating livestock that was healthier, more resilient, and better adapted to sustainable farming methods. "But perhaps the most important thing our father left us," Alexander said, nearing the end of their presentation, "was the understanding that true success comes from working together, with nature, with community, and with family." As if on cue, Perseus's offspring demonstrated their inherited intelligence by performing a complex feeding pattern that showcased the behavioral improvements their breeding program had achieved. During the question and answer session, a young farmer stood up. "Your success is impressive," she said, "but how can small farmers hope to compete with industrial agriculture?" Thomas smiled. "That's exactly what our father wanted to address. The Wellington way isn't about competing with industrial farming. It's about creating an alternative that works better for everyone. Our partner farms aren't just surviving, they're thriving." The evidence was undeniable. Farms following the Wellington methods showed improved soil health, reduced water usage, and higher yields. More importantly, they were building sustainable businesses that could be passed down to future generations. After the formal proceedings, the brothers hosted a reception in the gardens. As twilight approached, Perseus made what had become his traditional appearance, leading his flock in an evening display that still amazed visitors. "Your father would be proud, Mrs." Henderson said, joining them by the pond. "He always said the future of farming wasn't about getting bigger, it was about getting better." Looking out over their expanded facility, Thomas and Alexander could see their father's vision fully realized. The research institute, the partner farms, the sustainable practices, all growing naturally from that first small inheritance. "You know what I've been thinking," Alexander said as the last guests departed. "Maybe it's time to take this to the next level. There are farmers all over the world facing the same challenges we were." Thomas nodded, already seeing the possibilities. The Wellington way could work anywhere. Different animals, different crops, but the same principles. "Dad would like that," Claire added, joining them with a tablet showing their latest research results. "Using what we've learned here to help farmers everywhere." As night fell over the Yorkshire countryside, the brothers stood by the original pond where their journey had begun. Perseus settled his flock for the night, his white-marked wings still distinctive after all this time. "1 duck," Thomas mused, 2 acres and a father's wisdom. Who would have thought it would lead to all this? Alexander smiled, remembering their father's words from that video message. "True growth comes from nurturing what you have." He knew exactly what he was doing, Alexander said, giving each of us what we needed to learn, but making sure we had to work together to succeed. The stars emerged above their thriving enterprise, reflecting in the pond's still waters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the foundation their father had built, on sustainable practices, family bonds, and the understanding that the smallest beginnings could lead to the greatest changes, would continue to grow and flourish. Perseus quacked softly from his perch, a sound that seemed to echo with Edmund Wellington's gentle wisdom. The future of farming had indeed started with one very special duck, but it would continue through the combined efforts of two brothers who had learned their father's most important lesson, that working together, with nature and with each other, was the surest path to lasting success. The Wellington Sustainable Farming Initiative had gone global. 2 years after the inaugural Edmund Wellington Memorial Lecture, Thomas found himself standing in a rice paddy in Thailand, watching as local farmers adapted their father's principles to entirely new environments. "It's remarkable," Claire said, taking samples of the enriched soil. "The genetic markers your father developed are helping these rice varieties thrive with 40% less water." The scene before them was a world away from their Yorkshire farm, but the underlying principles remained the same. Local wildlife integrated naturally with the farming operation, creating a balanced ecosystem that practically maintained itself. Alexander emerged from a nearby bamboo shelter where he'd been video conferencing with their European headquarters. "The African project just got approved," he announced. 5 new partner farms in Kenya, all using sustainable methods adapted from Dad's research. The Wellington Way had evolved far beyond its humble beginnings with 1 duck and a pond. They discovered that Edmund's principles could be applied to any farming operation, anywhere in the world. The key was working with local farmers to adapt the methods to their specific needs and conditions. "Look at this," Claire called them over to a tablet. "The soil bacteria levels here are almost identical to what we see in Yorkshire. Different species, but the same beneficial relationships." A group of local children ran past, chasing ducks that bore a striking resemblance to Perseus's offspring. The breeding program had created varieties adapted to different climates, but all carried the distinctive white wing marking, now a globally recognized symbol of sustainable farming excellence. "Mr. Wellington," called their local partner, a 3rd-generation rice farmer named Somchai. "The Minister of Agriculture is here to see the results." As they toured the facility, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. What had started as a seemingly impractical inheritance had spawned a worldwide movement. The Wellington Research Institute now had satellite facilities on every continent, each adapting their father's methods to local conditions. "Your father's vision," the Thai minister commented, watching the integrated duck-rice system at work. "It transcends cultures. This is not just British farming or Thai farming, this is the future of farming itself." Alexander nodded, remembering their father's words. "True innovation doesn't fight nature. It learns from it." That evening, as the sun set over the rice paddies, the brothers received an unexpected video call from Yorkshire. Mrs. Henderson's excited face filled the screen. "You'll never believe what Perseus did today," she began, turning her camera toward the original pond. The elderly duck, now a grandfather many times over, had taught his entire flock a new behavior, one that made the pond's ecosystem even more efficient. Even in his twilight years, he was still proving that their father's work had only scratched the surface of what was possible. "He's still teaching us," Thomas said softly, watching the footage, "just like Dad." Back in their temporary quarters, the brothers reviewed proposals from new partner farms around the world. Each application told a similar story: small farmers struggling against industrial agriculture, looking for a sustainable way forward. "Remember when we thought this was just about saving the family company?" Alexander mused, scrolling through the applications. "Now we're helping save family farms everywhere," Thomas finished, exactly what Dad would have wanted. Claire joined them with the latest research data. The Wellington methods weren't just helping farms survive, they were reversing environmental damage, restoring ecosystems, and creating sustainable communities around the world. "Your father built this on relationships," she said, showing them satellite images of their partner farms across the globe. "Between brothers, between farmers and the land, between communities and their food sources. That's why it works everywhere we try it." As night fell over the Thai countryside, the brothers stepped outside to watch the stars emerge. Different constellations than they'd see in Yorkshire, but the same sky their father had gazed at while dreaming of a better way to farm. "You know what I realized?" Thomas said, listening to the evening chorus of frogs and ducks. "Dad's greatest innovation wasn't the genetics or the sustainable methods. It was understanding that real change happens through people working together." Alexander smiled, remembering their initial skepticism about the unusual inheritance. One very special duck taught 2 stubborn brothers how to work together. Now, We're teaching the world. In the distance, their Thai ducks settled in for the night, their white-marked wings catching the last rays of sunlight. A familiar sight in an unfamiliar land, proving that some wisdom truly was universal. Tomorrow we head to Kenya, Alexander said, checking their schedule. Another chance to share Dad's vision. And learn something new, Thomas added. Every place we go, every farmer we work with, adds something to what Dad started. The brothers stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights come on across the rice paddies. Their father's legacy had grown far beyond anything they could have imagined, but its heart remained the same, the simple wisdom that working with nature and with each other could change the world. Perseus's distant descendants called to each other across the paddies, their voices carrying the same determination that had started this journey. One duck, two brothers, and a father's dream of a better way to farm, now spreading hope and sustainable practices to every corner of the globe. The morning mist rolled across the original Wellington farm, now the heart of a worldwide sustainable farming movement. 5 years had passed since that fateful inheritance, and the brothers had gathered for a special occasion, the dedication of the Edmund Wellington Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Perseus, now in his golden years, sat contentedly by his pond, surrounded by generations of his offspring. The white wing marking he'd passed down had become a symbol of hope for small farmers everywhere, a living testament to Edmund Wellington's vision. "Hard to believe it all started here," Claire said, joining Thomas and Alexander on the observation deck. Below them, the facility buzzed with activity as visitors arrived from around the world for the dedication ceremony. The new center was a masterpiece of sustainable architecture, designed by Thomas himself. Solar panels and living walls merged seamlessly with traditional Yorkshire stone, while the surrounding gardens demonstrated every aspect of the Wellington way of farming. "Look who made it," Alexander nodded toward the entrance, where farmers from their global partner network were arriving, faces they'd come to know from Thailand, Kenya, Brazil, and dozens of other countries where their fathers' methods had taken root. The Wellington Sustainable Farming Initiative now encompassed over 1,000 partner farms worldwide. Each one told a similar story, of land renewed, communities strengthened, and hope restored through working with nature instead of against it. Inside the main hall, photographs told their story. Edmund Wellington by his pond, the brothers receiving their unusual inheritance, Perseus and his first offspring, the early construction of their sustainable farm, and now images from partner farms around the world. "Your father would be proud," Mrs. Henderson said, joining them by a display of Perseus's genetic legacy, though I suspect he knew exactly how this would turn out. The dedication ceremony brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. Gerald Blackthorne, now one of their strongest advocates in the corporate farming world. The local farmers who had first taken a chance on their methods. Researchers who had helped expand their father's work into new areas. As Thomas stepped up to the podium, he saw faces from every chapter of their story. The construction crew who'd built their first duck houses, the shareholders who doubted and then supported their vision, the international partners who'd helped take their methods global. 5 years ago, he began, our father left us an unusual inheritance. To my brother, he left the family company. To me, he left a duck. Laughter rippled through the audience, now familiar with the story that had become almost legendary in farming circles. What we didn't understand then, Alexander continued, joining his brother at the podium, was that he left us both exactly what we needed, not just to succeed in farming, but to succeed as brothers, as partners, as people. Claire presented the latest data from their worldwide network. The Wellington Way had not only proved profitable for small farmers, but was actively reversing environmental damage, rebuilding soil health, and creating resilient agricultural communities. But perhaps our father's greatest legacy, Thomas concluded, wasn't the sustainable methods or the genetics or even the worldwide network we've built. It was the simple wisdom that true growth comes from working together, with nature, with community, with family. After the ceremony, the brothers walked to Perseus's pond, where it had all begun. The elderly duck watched them approach, still regal despite his years. "You know what I think?" Alexander said, watching Perseus with his latest group of offspring. "Dad knew we'd need each other. The company needed the innovation and heart that came from starting small, and the farm needed the resources and reach of the company. He always said the best solutions were the natural ones, Thomas agreed. What's more natural than brothers learning to work together? Claire joined them, carrying a surprising discovery. Look at this, she said, showing them her tablet. We finally decoded the complete genetic sequence of Perseus's line. There's something embedded in the pattern, a message. The brothers leaned in to see a sequence that, when properly translated, spelled out words their father had encoded into the very DNA of their inheritance. Growth comes from love. As the sun set on their expanded kingdom, Perseus led his flock in one final evening display. His white-marked wing caught the light, sending flashes of brightness across the pond, nature's own celebration of how far they'd come. One duck, Thomas mused, watching the scene. Two brothers, Alexander added. And a father's wisdom, Claire finished. The Edmund Wellington Centre for Sustainable Agriculture shone in the evening light, its solar panels catching the last rays of sun. Inside, farmers from around the world shared stories, knowledge, and hope for the future. Outside, Perseus settled with his flock, his legacy living on in sustainable farms across the globe. The brothers stood together by the pond where their journey had begun, knowing that their father's greatest gift hadn't been the company or the duck or even the revolutionary farming methods. It had been the wisdom to see that the biggest changes start small, grow naturally, and thrive when nurtured with patience, understanding, and love. As night fell over Yorkshire, the stars emerged above their flourishing enterprise. Perseus quacked softly from his perch, a sound that seemed to carry Edmund Wellington's gentle laughter on the evening breeze. The future of farming had indeed started with one very special duck, but it would continue through generations of farmers worldwide, all working together to grow something greater than themselves. The Wellington brothers had come full circle, transforming an unexpected inheritance into a global movement. But more importantly, they had learned their father's final lesson, that the truest measure of success isn't in what you build, but in how you build it, together, naturally, and with love.